leaders of the public service had become too narrow over time. Compared to Coombs's time, there is now a strongly embedded acceptance that the Australian public service must be responsive to the government of the day, it must manage risk and deliver results for citizens and not simply comply with processes. All of these were matters that in Coombs's time were in need of repair. However, while not losing sight of those essential qualities of public service, some have begun to shift their attention to another question, namely whether public service thinking had become too reactive, too government-centred, too short-term. And this sparked a debate about what has been historically termed the stewardship role of senior public servants. This role requires public servants to be more proactive and forward-thinking, both in their management of the Australian public service workforce and in the development of policy thinking and models of service delivery. Now, some of this is about the responsibilities of today's leaders to build the capability needed within the Australian public service to respond to tomorrow's problems. And some of it relates to the importance that we should attach to having strategic policy advising capability within departments and to advise governments about what the policy issues and what policy approaches should be. The domestic and the international environments in which nations now operate presents political and public sector leaders with a number of pressing problems and challenges. These have become known as wicked problems in some cases, and they include, in our circumstances, nationwide water shortages, made worse by an unusually long drought, concern about seemingly intractable, multifaceted social issues such as Indigenous disadvantage, homelessness or mental health, and growing international attention to what Ross Garner has called diabolical problems such as climate change and security challenges, including those that stem from several large-scale terrorist attacks in various countries across the world. In September 2009, the Prime Minister appointed an advisory group chaired by the head of his department to develop a blueprint for the major reform of the public service. This report, Ahead of the Game, contains 28 recommendations around 4 themes and 9 areas, and relax, I'm not going to tell you what they were. All have been accepted by the current government. This agenda sets out a comprehensive change strategy for the public service, which first and foremost re-emphasises the needs and requirements of citizens. We mean here citizens broadly defined, basically those with whom we interact. And it says that the needs and requirements of citizens have to be at the centre of our policy analysis, our policy design, our service implementation and our service business models. But it also challenges the public service to be less reactive and more forward-looking. Ahead of the Game calls on the senior leaders of the public service to look again at how programs are designed and delivered to ensure that they meet the needs of citizens in ways that are convenient for them rather than for public servants, and to minimise the regulatory burdens that we place upon our people. These require more joined-up approaches to government and a re-examination of how we hold agencies accountable for results that need several agencies to work together. And some of these challenge our traditional accountability models, and I'll talk about that a bit later on. Ahead of the Game places specific responsibility on a new public service leadership forum. This is called a Secretaries Board, and they are charged to find better ways of joining up government services and articulating an accountability framework that reflects a contemporary understanding of how government needs to interact with its citizens. It also involves a strengthening of the capacity of the public service to provide strategic big-picture advice that addresses the most difficult challenges of the day, among them the capacity to identify fundamental rather than simply incremental change when the situation requires it. Agencies have been challenged to assess their capability in these matters and to systematically set about building capability if they are currently deficient. Ahead of the Game proposes that their performance should be assessed in a number of ways, notably through the introduction of systematic capability reviews that will be conducted centrally, using teams and approaches to be developed by the Commission. Importantly, however, Ahead of the Game puts renewed emphasis on the fact that the Australian Public Service is a long-lived institution with responsibilities to the future and not just to the present. The APS workforce needs to be resilient in the face of the unexpected, and it needs to develop policy-making capability ahead of predictable need. In other words, to look towards tomorrow, see what issues might emerge in the future that we should begin to research today ahead of need. In a sense, to do a bit of scenario planning as well. The new Secretaries Board, comprising portfolio secretaries and the Commissioner, along with an expanded senior leadership forum, which is called the APS 200, which by some miracle has 200 people in it, will be central in driving the stewardship function. For example, a small group has already been formed from within the APS 200 to take forward the government's APS capability and service delivery improvement agenda as set out in the Management Advisory Committee's report, Empowering Change, Fostering Innovation in the Australian Public Service, that was released last May. Now, along with its responsibilities to identify better ways to join up government for citizens, the Board also has responsibility to oversight the development of the public sector workforce, including through more centralised approaches to leadership training and talent management, and I'll say a bit more about those a bit later. The change process proposed in Ahead of the Game will have far-reaching consequences for Australians and for public servants. It recognises that many traditional approaches to public policy no longer work as consistently or as well as they once did. Consequently, governments and public servants increasingly have to review and, as necessary, refresh their models of policy formulation and service delivery in response to those ever-changing and, frankly, ever-growing expectations of our citizens. And the public service leaders cannot perform this role well without better managing their organisations to ensure that they are adaptive, they're self-critical, they're outward-oriented, particularly to be citizens-focused in that kind of broad sense, and that it has a strong focus on future-oriented thinking. Ahead of the Game sets out how they can go about this, doing it internally and in its relationships with citizens and the broader public. My second theme was centralisation and decentralisation. And I referred earlier to the shifting balance between centralisation and decentralisation over time. The 1976 Coombs Royal Commission reaffirmed the need for centralised oversight of public sector employment legislation by the then Public Sector Board, which was the body responsible at the time for APS industrial relations and for its human relations functions. It was a predecessor to the Commission. However, in the interests of achieving a more open but better integrated public service, Coombs called for the creation of a separate cadre of senior executives in the APS and the beginnings of what became the agenda of devolution from the centre, more specifically in this case from the Public Service Board, of greater responsibility for agency operations to agency heads. This began a process of devolution of human resource management that played out over very many years, and it culminated in the abolition of the Public Service Board in the late 80s and the introduction of the current Public Service Act in the late 90s. The board was replaced by the Public Service Commission, which had a relatively limited role. It was responsible for developing the senior executive service and training, for consulting and advising the government on public sector change, and for some HR systems and capability alignment functions, such as recruitment, promotion, dismissal, mobility and retirement matters. Under the provisions of the Public Service Act 1999, though, agency heads were given all of the powers of the employer over their staff, subject to, pretty much only, a new ethics framework enshrined in the Act in the form of legally enforceable APS values and the Code of Conduct. Now, parallel reforms had occurred in respect of financial management, so that agency heads and their senior managers were now provided with full responsibility for recognising their organisation's budgetary, performance, accountability and risk management priorities with those relating to recruitment, training, employee development and leadership. Eventually, agency heads also received power to determine pay and conditions within their agency, and again, subject only to light central oversight. Some centralised elements remained, however. In the cases of the human resources management, the Public Service Commissioner's role, for example, was to be one of promoting and reviewing APS employment policies and practices across the public service, as well as quality assurance in the areas of people management, training and career development and leadership. The essential point, though, is that these centralised elements were very light-handed. The Commission was to promote and encourage good practice, but it had relatively limited authority or leverage to enforce compliance. The 2010 blueprint, ahead of the game, has recommended a subtle change of direction. It is an amalgam of the past, of existing and some new approaches to the challenge, and it challenges many of us to call for some innovative thinking. In the human capital area, for example, ahead of the game proposes that we move beyond people management, as we've traditionally defined it, to a more holistic philosophical approach which recognises that the short and longer term capability of our organisations needs to be planned for and systematically developed. It moves into an era of human capital management, not just people management. This reflects a realisation that good people management underpins an effective human capital strategy, which in turn underpins the capacity of the public service to achieve its strategic objectives, as interpreted by the government, and meet the evolving demands of citizens. And it also proposes, in essence, a degree of re-centralisation, though not to the same order as we knew it in the past. It proposes that agency heads retain all the powers of an employer, but that these powers should be exercised within a more consistent, more centrally determined and more closely monitored framework. The Commission will have more and stronger levers to promote good practice and to expose poor practice if the recommendations of the advisory group are adopted by the incoming government. Now, the current government's policy is that this will be reflected, for example, in new arrangements for better aligning pay and conditions across agencies, and on efficiency grounds, in a continuation of the trend towards more centralisation of ICT management. So these are two areas, pay and conditions and ICT, where on efficiency grounds we're moving back towards a more centralised approach, at least in terms of the recommendations of this report. And in that context, ahead of the game requires the Commission to do a number of things, including to establish Australian Public Service-wide frameworks for human capital management, including in respect of workforce planning, to simplify recruitment processes so as to attract the best applicants from the public and from the private sectors, to revise the legislative values that are in the Public Service Act to a smaller set that are better able to influence workforce behaviour. Most people can't remember the current 15, and you might recall that we've just concluded a consultation process